Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. Part 13. Main cases of attempts at raising wages or resisting their fall. Let us now seriously consider the main cases in which a rise of wages is attempted or a reduction of wages resisted. 1. We have seen that the value of the laboring power, or in more popular parlance, the value of labor, is determined by the value of necessaries or by the quantity of labor required to produce them. If, then, in a given country the value of the daily average necessaries of the laborer represented 6 hours of labor expressed in 3 shillings, the laborer would have to work 6 hours daily to produce an equivalent for his daily maintenance. If the whole working day was 12 hours, the capitalist would pay him the value of his labor by paying him 3 shillings. Half the working day would be unpaid labor, and the rate of profit would amount to 100%. But now suppose that, consequent upon a decrease of productivity, more labor should be wanted to produce, say, the same amount of agricultural produce, so that the price of the average daily necessaries should rise from 3 to 4 shillings. In that case, the value of labor would rise by 1/3, or 33 1/3%. 8 hours of the working day would be required to produce an equivalent for the daily maintenance of the laborer according to his old standard of living. The surplus labor would therefore sink from 6 hours to 4, and the rate of profit from 100 to 50%. But in insisting upon a rise of wages, the laborer would only insist upon getting the increased value of his labor, like every other seller of a commodity, who, the cost of his commodities having increased, tries to get its increased value paid. If wages did not rise, or not sufficiently rise, to compensate for the increased values of necessaries, the price of labor would sink below the value of labor, and the laborer's standard of life would deteriorate. But a change might also take place in an opposite direction. By virtue of the increased productivity of labor, the same amount of the average daily necessaries might sink from 3 to 2 shillings, or only 4 hours out of the working day, instead of 6, be wanted to reproduce an equivalent for the value of the daily necessaries. The working man would now be able to buy with 2 shillings as many necessaries as he did before with 3 shillings. Indeed, the value of labor would have sunk, but diminished value would command the same amount of commodities as before. Then profits would rise from 3 to 4 shillings, and the rate of profit from 100 to 200%. Although the laborer's absolute standard of life would have remained the same, his relative wages, and therewith his relative social position, as compared with that of the capitalist, would have been lowered. If the working man should resist that reduction of relative wages, he would only try to get some share in the increased productive powers of his own labor, and to maintain his former relative position in the social scale. Thus, after the abolition of the Corn Laws, and in flagrant violation of the most solemn pledges given during the anti-Corn Law agitation, the English factory lords generally reduced wages 10%. The resistance of the workmen was at first baffled, but, consequent upon circumstances I cannot now enter upon, the 10% lost were afterwards regained. 2. The values of necessaries, and consequently the value of labor, might remain the same, but a change might occur in their money prices, consequent upon a previous change in the value of money. By the discovery of more fertile mines and so forth, 2 ounces of gold might, for example, cost no more labor to produce than 1 ounce did before. The value of gold would then be depreciated by 1/2, or 50%. As the values of all other commodities would then be expressed in twice their former money prices, so also the same with the value of labor. 12 hours of labor, formerly expressed in 6 shillings, would now be expressed in 12 shillings. If the working man's wages should remain 3 shillings, instead of rising to 6 shillings, the money price of his labor would only be equal to half the value of his labor, and his standard of life would fearfully deteriorate. This would also happen in a greater or lesser degree if his wages should rise, but not proportionately to the fall in the value of gold. In such a case, nothing would have been changed, either in the productive powers of labor, or in supply and demand, or in values. Nothing would have changed except the money names of those values. To say that in such a case the workman ought not to insist upon a proportionate rise of wages is to say that he must be content to be paid with names instead of with things. All past history proves that whenever such depreciation of money occurs, the capitalists are on the alert to seize this opportunity for defrauding the workman. A very large school of political economists assert that, consequent upon the new discoveries of gold lands, the better working of silver mines, and the cheaper supply of quicksilver, the value of precious metals has again depreciated. This would explain the general and simultaneous attempts on the continent at a rise of wages. 3. We have till now supposed that the working day has given limits. The working day, however, has, by itself, no constant limits. It is the constant tendency of capital to stretch it to its utmost physically possible length, because in the same degree surplus labor, and consequently the profit resulting therefrom, will be increased. The more capital succeeds in prolonging the working day, the greater the amount of other people's labor it will appropriate. During the 17th and even the first 2/3 of the 18th century, a 10 hours working day was the normal working day all over England. During the anti-Jacobin War, which was in fact a war waged by the British barons against the British working classes, capital celebrated its bacchanalia and prolonged the working day from 10 to 12, 14, 18 hours. Malthus, by no means a man whom you would suspect of a maudlin sentimentalism, declared in a pamphlet, published about 1815, that if this sort of thing was to go on, the life of the nation would be attacked at its very source. A few years before the general introduction of newly invented machinery, about 1765, a pamphlet appeared in England under the title An Essay on Trade. The anonymous author, an avowed enemy of the working classes, declaims on the necessity of expanding the limits of the working day. Among other means to this end, he proposes working houses, which, he says, ought to be houses of terror. And what is the length of the working he prescribes for these houses of terror? 12 hours, the very same time which in 1832 was declared by capitalists, political economists, and ministers to be not only the existing but the necessary time of labor for a child under 12 years. By selling his laboring power, and he must do so under the present system, the working man makes over to the capitalist the consumption of that power, but within certain rational limits. He sells his laboring power in order to maintain it, apart from its natural wear and tear, but not to destroy it. In selling his laboring power at its daily or weekly value, it is understood that in 1 day or 1 week, that laboring power shall not be submitted to 2 days or 2 weeks' waste or wear and tear. Take a machine worth £1,000. If it is used up in 10 years, it will add to the value of the commodities in whose production it assists £100 yearly. If it is used up in 5 years, it will add 200 pounds yearly, or the value of its annual wear and tear is in the inverse ratio to the quickness with which it is consumed. But this distinguishes the working man from the machine. Machinery does not wear out exactly in the same ratio in which it is used. Man, on the contrary, decays in a greater ratio than would be visible from the mere numerical addition of work. In their attempts at reducing the working day to its former rational dimensions, or, where they cannot enforce a legal fixation of a normal working day, at checking overwork by a rise of wages, a rise not only in proportion to the surplus time exacted, but in a greater proportion, working men fulfill only a duty to themselves and their race. They only set limits to the tyrannical usurpations of capital. Time is the room of human development. A man who has no free time to dispose of, whose whole lifetime, apart from the mere physical interruptions by sleep, meals, and so forth, is absorbed by his labor for the capitalist, is less than a beast of burden. He is a mere machine for producing foreign wealth, broken in body and brutalized in mind. Yet the whole history of modern industry shows that capital, if not checked, will recklessly and ruthlessly work to cast down the whole working class to this utmost state of degradation. In prolonging the working day, the capitalist may pay higher wages and still lower the value of labor if the rise of wages does not correspond to the greater amount of labor extracted and the quicker decay of the laboring power thus caused. This may be done in another way. Your middle-class statisticians will tell you, for instance, that the average wages of factory families in Lancashire has risen. They forget that instead of the labor of the man, the head of the family, his wife and perhaps 3 or 4 children are now thrown under the juggernaut wheels of capital, and that the rise of the aggregate wages does not correspond to the aggregate surplus labor extracted from the family. Even with given limits of the working day, such as they now exist in all branches of industry subjected to the factory laws, a rise of wages may become necessary, if only to keep up the old standard value of labor. By increasing the intensity of labor, a man may be made to expend as much vital force in 1 hour as he formerly did in 2. This has, to a certain degree, been effected in the trades, placed under the Factory Acts, by the acceleration of machinery and the greater number of working machines which a single individual has now to superintend. If the increase in the intensity of labor or the mass of labor spent in an hour keeps some fair proportion to the decrease in the extent of the working day, the working man will still be the winner. If this limit is overshot, he loses in one form what he has gained in another, and 10 hours of labor may then become as ruinous as 12 hours were before. In checking this tendency of capital, by struggling for a rise of wages corresponding to the rising intensity of labor, the working man only resists the depreciation of his labor and the deterioration of his race. 4. All of you know that, from reasons I have not now to explain, capitalistic production moves through certain periodical cycles. It moves through a state of quiescence, growing animation, prosperity, overtrade, crisis, and stagnation. The market prices of commodities and the market rates of profit follow these phases, now sinking below their averages, now rising above them. Considering the whole cycle, you will find that one deviation of the market price is being compensated by the other, and that taking the average of the cycle, the market prices of commodities are regulated by their values. Well, during the phases of sinking market prices and the phases of crisis and stagnation, the working man, if not thrown out of employment altogether, is sure to have his wages lowered. Not to be defrauded, he must, even with such a fall of market prices, debate with the capitalist in what proportional degree a fall of wages has become necessary. If, during the phases of prosperity, when extra profits are made, he did not battle for a rise of wages, he would, taking the average of one industrial cycle, not even receive his average wages or the value of his labor. It is the utmost height of folly to demand that while his wages are necessarily affected by the adverse phases of the cycle, he should exclude himself from compensation during the prosperous phases of the cycle. Generally, the values of all commodities are only realized by the compensation of the continuously changing market prices springing from the continuous fluctuations of demand and supply. On the basis of the present system, labor is only a commodity like others. It must, therefore, pass through the same fluctuations to fetch an average price corresponding to its value. It would be absurd to treat it on the one hand as a commodity, and want on the other hand to exempt it from the laws which regulate the prices of commodities. The slave receives a permanent and fixed amount of maintenance. The wage laborer does not. He must try to get a rise of wages in the one instance, if only to compensate for a fall of wages in the other. If he resigned himself to accept the will, the dictates of the capitalist as a permanent economical law, he would share in all the miseries of the slave without the security of the slave. 5. In all the cases I have considered, and they form 99 out of 100, you have seen that a struggle for a rise of wages follows only in the track of previous changes, and is the necessary offspring of previous changes in the amount of production, the productive powers of labor, the value of labor, the value of money, the extent or the intensity of labor extracted, the fluctuations of market prices, dependent upon the fluctuations of demand and supply, and consistent with the different phases of the industrial cycle. In one word, as reactions of labor against the previous action of capital. By treating the struggle for a rise of wages independently of all these circumstances, by looking only upon the change of wages, and overlooking all other changes from which they emanate, you proceed from a false premise in order to arrive at false conclusions. You have reached the end of Value, Price, and Profit, Part 13, Main Cases of Attempts at Raising Wages or Resisting Their Fall, by Karl Marx. Click on the links at the end of this video to go to the playlist or the next chapter if it's available. If you enjoy this content and would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe.